Welcome, everyone, to another broadcast of The Soul of the Everyman on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. Pick them up at artistfirst.com. We welcome your questions and comments. Please use DJ at artistfirst.com. And now, your hosts, Michael and Margaret Lyons.
And thank you very much, Seaman. And I am Michael Lyons.
And I'm Margaret.
And thank God.
Yes, thank God we're here.
Thank God we're here. So tonight, we thought we'd do just a tiny little subject. Just a little, a banal nothing. Something we can just knock out of the park. No, unfortunately, no. But we're gonna give it our best shot. Tonight we're going to talk about God. Just all of him. Actually, to give you just a tiny, 3 seconds of background, Margaret came up with an idea to talk about the difference between a personal God and an impersonal God. And I thought, well, that's, I don't know where that's going exactly, but we kind of worked our way around to talking about, in essence, the various types of God that people relate to, or in fact, and we're looking at people, not just individuals, although that's part of it, but societies and over the many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years that human beings have been essaying their relationship with the infinite. And so with that, very small, almost insignificant subject in mind, we decided to talk about the 5 stages of God.
Right.
So somewhere near the middle, we may hear a lightning bolt or a crack of thunder or something, but we're gonna go for it.
We will endeavor to do our very best.
Skies are turning dark already out there. I don't know. We're gonna endeavor to do our very best, as Margaret said. So, without ado, I want to go right into the quote because we have an interesting and excellent quote. We found a quote from a gentleman who's actually a Franciscan monk. Priest.
He's a Franciscan priest.
He's a Franciscan priest, which means he's a Catholic priest of the Franciscan order, in case you didn't know. But he's a very interesting fellow because he speaks around the country, and maybe you've heard of him. I had heard of, when we looked him up, I'd heard of one of his works called Falling Upward, which I think is actually somewhat famous. His name is Richard Rohr, and if you look him up on YouTube or online, he's a very interesting speaker. And what he, not to go too deeply into his philosophy, but one of the things that he talks about is something he refers to as unitary consciousness. And he relates it back to a lot of the earlier, more mystical origins of Christianity. Catholic and Christian theology. And how he, in fact, says in one of his lectures how it's sort of all kind of changed with the advent of the written, or rather the published, or the widespread distribution of the published word. Because in that advent, he said that was automatically created sort of a duality, sort of a points of argumentation, points of misinterpretation. And yes, all of that is good. But yet it kind of takes away from a much more holistic view and a much more mystical view, and something that was much more familiar to early humans in their relationship to the infinite.
Right. Well, the foundation of that was the fact that most people couldn't read. So
correct. Yeah.
It was a verbal hand down.
Right, the verbal tradition, or oral tradition, rather.
Right, oral tradition. And that's one of the main reasons why the services were always, in an environment that was supposed to transcend your everyday life into a place where, well, maybe heaven is this vast. That's why you had these huge cathedrals made. And the idea was the word was going to be read to you in that setting because you couldn't read on your own, unless you were a nobleman of some.
Or a monk or something where you were educated.
You had the ability to read the Bible, and you had access to it. And what Father Rohr was saying is that when the printing press was invented, that's when it became possible for the word to just spread across the world. Mm-hmm. Because now, if you can read, you'll be able to access this on your own. Mm-hmm. And that was the start of it all.
And the start of, in essence, the duality and also the arguing. One of the things that he also mentions later on in one of his lectures is that the Vulgate, which comes from the Latin root, which we translate into our English language as vulgar, but the Vulgate is that the word, which used to be published in Latin or Greek, was published in the local language of the people who were living there. So it would be published in German or French or English or whatever, Italian. And so the Vulgate also was a great way of spreading the word. I mean, the fact that people could read, that were more educated, all good things. The fact that they could then read and interpret the word, all good things. But in that process, we moved away from unitary consciousness. And interestingly enough, when we talk in those terms, you're talking about, the consciousness, the being. And when you talk about the breaking of that into duality, then you're talking about the ego, which takes its foreground presence, tries to occupy the mental facility, the emotional facility, and it kind of buries the being. It kind of creates an internal, we call it, you could say, duality, but it's also a tension, not dysmorphia, but I've lost the word. But, in essence, within yourself, you have a conflict. You have the conflict of being versus ego. And that reflects itself outward into the conflicts of the many, many schisms and the place where we find ourselves today, which is that the word itself is endlessly argued over.
Yep. No, it's true. Everyone they have different interpretations, mm-hmm. and they're all the arguing about who's valid, who's not valid.
The ego loves that. Who's right? Who's not right?
Right, and
who's in, who's out?
Seriously, have entered into the Pharisaical mindset. That was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All they did was argue over interpretation. Yep. And they were the educated that were arguing over interpretation. Now we've got everybody arguing over interpretation because we can all read.
We can all read. But let's go backward a little bit back to Father Rohr. So the quote that we have from him is a great one. Would you like to? Do you have it in front of you?
Sure. Okay. God for us, God alongside us, God within us. Richard Rohr.
Mm. And in the light of what we're talking about, that sort of exemplifies it's a very mystical thing. And he talks about a little bit about how if you look at the actual words of Jesus in the New Testament, or in the Gospels rather, you'll find that Jesus talks often of this unitary consciousness. I am, the Father is within me, and I am one with the Father, and the Father is within me. Well, that's unitary. That says all, the infinite, the incomprehensible universal presence is also you. Well, that's just
is within you, and you within it.
Exactly, and today in the modern interpretation that Tolle says, it's basically the exact same thing. Even Tolle is well versed in many different modalities, and he relates directly back to these words of Jesus and says, what Christ is talking about here when he says the kingdom of heaven, he's really talking about the consciousness. The fact that the eternal life is in the moment of now. So this spiritual and mystical origins of Christianity, and it relates back to many other modalities. Buddhism has a tremendous, tremendous connection to the unitary consciousness and to seeking, the enlightenment or seeking oneness with the all. Christianity has those same roots. We kind of had them, walked away from them, and thank goodness we're kind of slowly coming back to them, as was Father Rohr was saying in one of his lectures. We're slowly coming back to the idea that this was abandoned, and we lost a lot in abandoning it.
Well, it goes back, way back. The Essenes also had this kind of mindset, leaning, and they were destroyed by the Jewish culture.
You should just mention who the Essenes were.
Well, they were a group, a community that was in the desert that immersed themselves. It was almost like a monastery. And in some ways, it's almost like what you see the monasteries in for Buddhism, where they are set aside and they are working very intimately with themselves so that they can clear a lot of the worldly connections and enter into that state of being able to commune with God. So that was considered blasphemous for a lot of traditional religions, especially Jewish tradition was very strict. There were many, many rules.
Exactly, and the Essenes were seen as a heretical sect of Judaism, they were messianic in one regard. They were looking for the return of the Messiah. They were also, trying to reinterpret the Talmud in the light of true connection to God. So Christ's message was much more, if I can say the word, Essenic than it was Talmudic. And of course, he has his own. He kind of completed that whole thing in the sense that he claimed and is the Jewish Messiah. That was his mission. I think we're getting a little bit off the beaten path of the track here. So the 5 stages of God, if we launch into our own,
this particular classification, if you would, if you looking at it in terms of one's relationship to God, and the first stage, of course, is utter disbelief. He doesn't exist.
Okay, we can go in that direction. I had a little bit different interpretation, but utter disbelief is no relationship to God.
Right. And truth of the matter is, when you're small, all you know is you. You don't even think of, God. You just think of you and your needs, and then understanding that mom's there. So it's very basic. You can appreciate things on a nonverbal level, but you don't think of it in terms of, a concept of God as a being. So it's very interesting because many people slip into that non-belief thing. No, I never needed it. I was all right. The way I handle my life is the way I want to handle it, and he doesn't exist.
Certainly there's that. There's this sort of non-belief. But I believe if you are in that stage, what you do is you supplant, because there's, if you look at human beings in general, there's an essential recognition of something much more vast than the corporeal or the material, and you deny that to your peril, and you see the mystical part of you is going to be denied. It will not be denied. It will kind of manifest itself in other ways, And when you're in that stage where you say, well, I have no need, or I don't believe, or I don't really have any relationship with the infinite, it's there and it gets supplanted. And so you see it in older cultures where the creation itself is worshipped. And interestingly enough, in the modern day, we have a lot of creation worshipers. They would deny it, but those who say that the earth is some sort of a deity, or they say that the earth is something which has to be worshipped in some way, revered, or in some way sanctified. What they're doing is in essence supplanting this need for a mystical relationship with something greater than oneself, with the creation, with the material. And you see it in ancient cultures, with animism, with the worship of, let's say, trees or rocks or rivers, and kind of giving them lightning and so on, the wind, giving this sort of a personality, a beinghood, something which is so powerful it must have its own purposes, it must have its own consciousness. And so you see that today, even now, with people who worship the ecology or worship various types of causes, and very often this will be right alongside with, well, there's no such thing as a being or a infinite presence, but yet there's this vast universe that I have to pick pieces of and worship, and abase myself to, make myself lower than for argument's sake, a tree or a rock or something of that nature. So this first stage comes from that sort of stage of life that you mentioned very early on, where you just say, well, I'll worship this large thing, this ocean of unknown things that I'm going to put in place of that relationship.
Well, you see the wonder. Usually it's a feeling of wonder that comes over you when you look at something like the night sky.
Yes.
And you're just awestruck by the vastness of it. And then you see the earth itself and say, oh, this tree, where did this come from? And it's just that feeling of, wow, there are things here that I just don't know. And that's the beginning of understanding that there's a part of you that is connected to mystery. So when you want to concretize it, in other words, solidify it in some way, I just love this tree, and they want to hug the tree. We used to have kids come in, and we used to have these giant crystals that.
In the store.
Yeah, that they would be able to wrap their arms around, and I had so many little ones go, "Can I hug the crystal?" Like, sure, you can hug the crystal. I just love it. Can I have this in my room, Mommy? Just like you would have a cat. You want the cat or the dog in your room. But that connection, there's a natural connection. And that's the first step. It's like, well, if someone tells you, you're looking at it going, oh, well, you can see the rhythm of it all around you. Nature is working in a certain way. And that's the beginning of that nature worship. Not looking past anything except, well, this is wonderful. And not to say there's anything wrong with it.
Or frightening, something which is so awesomely powerful as a fire or a lightning or wind that destroys or floods or hurricanes or whatever, these things become objects of worship. And you mentioned this earlier, these are very impersonal gods. They're capricious. The one day you find earlier ancient peoples, going out and trying to sacrifice to the wind, or to a volcano, or to something so powerful to try and placate it, because it's this impersonal, seemingly capricious force that can either be beneficial or destructive. And what does it want from us, and how can we appease it? How can we somehow,
like
abase
Pele.
ourselves? Like Pele, exactly. The god of the volcano.
The goddess of the volcano.
Goddess of the volcano. So this is a very impersonal God, and it's a very external God, and it really is, worshiping that which is part of the creation. It also can become sort of a body worship, if you will. That is one initial stage of God. The next one that you find in many ancient cultures is slightly more personal, but it's still external. It's still a very big duality. You start to worship God as Superman. And what I mean by that is you see it in many ways in the Roman gods or the Greek gods, any kind of pantheistic type of god array, if you will, where each one of these gods exemplifies certain human characteristics, but set in a very sort of superhuman way. They're all powerful. They're able to control these forces of wind or lightning or thunder or rain, but they have a personality, and they interact with people as sort of man interacting with God on a very personal, almost person-to-person level, but where you're a weaker, fainter copy of these all-powerful beings that have their own purposes, but then they seem to be more like us. The statues of Roman gods, or Vulcan, or Juno, or Greek equivalents, Zeus or Hera, or so on, are super beautiful men and women with great muscular physiques or beautiful countenances, and they have their various powers, and they have their all fights together, and it's all politics and war, and it's very relatable. It's like, yay, they're like our relatives or something, but they're also like your relatives that are much more powerful and much richer and more beautiful than you.
Well, yeah, they're more powerful. And you think of all the other God figures as well throughout the different cultures and religions, and they're all anthropomorphic. They're all humanish.
Yeah.
And they all have an ego. A very big ego. So if humans have a little ego, the gods have a big ego. That's true. That's what especially the Greek gods, my goodness, their egos are huge.
Yes, and their lusts are outsized. They drink to excess, they fornicate to excess, they have tremendous passionate tempers, and they do all of these things that people want to do, and better than we can, and more powerfully than we can, and they have these abilities to control the world in the ways that people can. You say, well, I can't uproot a tree, or I can't cause an earthquake, or I can't throw a lightning bolt, but Zeus can, or Vulcan can, or whomever can. You also think you find in some of these, the Greek gods are very human looking, but you find blends of humans and animals in many of these sort of pantheistic god concepts, and they're very conceptual gods. They're very mental, egoic gods. They have the heads of wolves or lions or bears, or they're eagles, or they're
Egyptian,
Egyptians, exactly. You have this is a wonderful example, because in the Egyptian gods you had the representative of the gods on earth, who was the god man, the pharaoh. The sun itself, again, part of creation, was putting its power within the pharaoh itself. And then you also have these animalistic type gods, where a wolf head, or a head of a serpent,
Jackal.
Or something. Jackal's head, exactly.
That was the god of death.
Or Horus with his, I think it's a hawk.
Yeah,
hawk head. And so these are showing that they have these amazing powers, and we can see it again in the natural world. You see that an animal like a leopard can leap 20 feet in the air. Well, no human can do that, or a hawk or an eagle flies so high and dives so fast and grasps at prey, and it just has all these powers that we don't have. So you relate to that in a mystical but a very sort of personal way. So, well, this is some god's representation. This is a being whom I have to appease or worship or relate to, but it's still very egoic, very mental, very conceptual, and it's still very impersonal. These gods are not your neighbors. They're the people way up on the hill living in golden houses that you can only scrape by.
Well, they're a little more relatable because they've got humanish form
and humanish foibles.
Yes. Yep. And they never leave the women alone, the human women.
Well, that's true, too. There's all that interaction going on, especially with the Greek gods. They're always dallying. But you have this.
But how many cultures do we have that story?
The Nephilim.
Yeah. In the Anunnaki.
The Anunnaki, the angels.
Yeah. Just how many? I mean, really, when you think about it, it's cross-cultural.
All your Babylonian gods are sort of the same thing. These blend of these superhumans who have this sort of perverse desire to interact with people all the time. You see it also in American Indian cultures.
Well, the Babylonians they didn't stop at just humans. they did it. They just went across everything in the world.
Just anything
moving
wasn't nailed down.
Right.
Well,
I'm serious. This is where you get these crazy looking god figures with them.
Yeah,
Seriously.
Well, when you're a god, you can do whatever you want.
Well, this is what that attitude is. It's like an extension of the ego. Well, now I have power. It's like you're taking a 4-year-old and you're giving him ultimate power.
Well, exactly. And now
you're in God mode on the game, and you're killing everything.
Exactly what I was going to say. You see it today in your Marvel action movies. Where everybody has all these superpowers, mental superpowers, incredible speed, incredible strength. All these various, animistic, like you have wolf talons, or you have the ability to control metal with your mind. All those are basically god powers, that have been brought into it's just a movie. Well, people worship these things. People make whole, sort of mental and emotional relationships with these. Well, let's call them fictional characters, but they're basically the same thing that the Greeks would have called gods, and they worship them and put them on a pedestal, make them greater than they are, almost spend their lives trying to be these types of things. And so this is another way of trying to get the ego, the human ego, the actual ego within, to see itself writ large in these superhuman figures.
Right. And it's interesting because that is where man is sitting there going, well, how can we relate to this? What is out there? And with every Greek play, by the way, that's why life was a tragedy all the time. Seriously, everything was a tragedy. You couldn't, you look at the gods and you go, that's the best we can do. There's no peace or harmony to be had. You're always running from something.
Yes, exactly. And you're always sort of trying to appease that thing, or trying to put one god against each other. The Greeks would do this all the time. They would appeal to one god to protect you from another god. One god's out to get you, and the other god's there to protect you. So these are also still very impersonal gods. Very external gods, sort of superhuman or super animalistic type gods, very fantastical gods.
They're very egoic.
And very egoic.
The truth of the matter is they're exceedingly egoic. They are caricatures of humans with godlike powers.
Exactly.
And you look at that and you're like, all right, it's as I said, it's a rather depressing.
It is. It can be.
It's very depressing. It's like, you mean that's the best we're going to...
Well, but it isn't, because the next stage you see, the next stage of God, is kind of good segue into this. You would see, and this goes back to a number of different cultures, started to bring into their oral traditions the idea of a monotheistic God, the one God, the greater God, the God of all things. And this wasn't worshiping creation, because what this God did is it created everything, and even including all the other gods and all the other powers and everything else in the universe was all attributed to this one God. And we see this in the Judaic tradition of monotheism, but there were other similar sort of modalities of this monotheistic God. Now, the new concept here was that this is a single God, the God greater than all other gods, and that every other God was subordinate to this, and that all things within the universe and all people were created by this one God, whether they knew it or not. This was not, you didn't have to believe. It was still, this was the God of all things. And the Jewish tradition, this next stage of God, sees this as a much more personal God. This God is like unto us. This God created us. If you look at the story of Adam and Eve, is that God created man, or in this case, beings on the earth, in his own likeness and image. So now we aren't just these pieces of creation that have to deal with lightning and thunder and volcanoes, and nor are we just worshiping the trees or the rocks. No, we are one and akin with the Spirit of God. God breathed it into the clay, and his Spirit entered in and gave it life. Mm-hmm. So this is a much, much more advanced concept. It's still a concept, but it straightens the whole thing out. It says, okay, the world and all things in it are created by one unitary thing, one unitary being. Our place in that whole universe is we are the representatives of this infinity in creation, and we owe our life, our being, our essence to that one thing. Now, it's still very, very distant, and it's very, very powerful. And in the Judaic tradition, very few people would have any real relationship with God. There are those who would ascend the mountain, the prophets, Moses or Elijah, or you can name them, and there's not that many in the Old Testament. But these folks were the representatives of all the rest of us unwashed people. And they would go up and actually interact in the most humble way, but actually interact with God, and then bring that back down the mountain, mm-hmm. to the rest of us. And, it would get discussed amongst camp, and then they would go back up and bring our concerns back up to God. Right. Moses is so beautiful in Exodus, and in the Mosaic tradition of Exodus, where he looks upon the countenance of God, and then when he comes back down, his face is shining. They can't even look upon him because he's looked upon God. Right. And now he's so incredibly bathed in this glory that no one can look upon him. Yeah,
he had to put a veil over his face.
Right, exactly. So in this case, certain ones of us can have a real relationship with God, but then the rest of us get it sort of secondhand.
Well, it was very interesting because before all that, during the Exodus, everybody had access to God. He was in the cloud by day and the fire by night. They're going through the desert. And they turned them to Moses and said, "We can't bear this. We can't bear him.
Too much."
Yeah, it's too much. You have to go up there. We can't have him come down to us.
Mm-hmm. Too scary.
It was just
overwhelming.
Overwhelming. Yeah. They couldn't handle it. So they would send Moses to be the representative.
Right. Moses, you go.
But the truth of the matter is they had the opportunity to begin that relationship with God right then and there, and decided, no, we can't do that. We can't do that.
We can't we can't, we don't feel worthy enough. We don't feel, we know it's too much for us. It's so overwhelming. We don't know what to do. We're lost. And you have to pick a representative and send them up the mountain.
But if you think about it in terms of mankind, you're picking the lesser. And why are you picking the lesser? Because you were scared to death.
The lesser relationship. The second, the further you're distancing yourself from God because you're scared.
Right. In other words, he was offering to them to be with them all the time. And there would be no barrier.
And you see it from the beginning in the garden. This is beautiful poetic language, but we'll use the poetic language. In the Garden of Eden, God walks among man as a being is in the garden, and God is a constant companion. The garden is, in essence, an aspect of the eternal, where we are in direct, we, represented all of us by the being that he first created, are all represented. We have direct relationship, direct access to God, and we're so perfectly innocent that it's like, yeah, it's just God. It's all cool. We get to talk with God. God's right there. Hey, God, how you doing? And now after the fall and after the break between God and man, now suddenly there's a huge gulf. There's a huge distance. We don't know what to do anymore. We don't have that direct connection. And that still is a very personal God, but it's now distanced. It's become, yes, we are of this being. We are a piece of this, but we're so fallen, right? We're so debased that we can't stand to bring ourselves, our horrible, fallen selves into his presence because it's too terrible and too awesome.
Well, the one interpretation of that is to understand that you were in a body that could take that very high frequency of God. It's akin to being able to stand in the middle of the sun. Your body was capable of doing that. Because in his presence, he's pure light, super high energy. And the fall means that our bodies degraded down into a form that we could no longer do that. We couldn't be in that high intensity energy because we felt like we were gonna die. And that reminder comes back even in the Exodus scene where the Israelites are like, no, we can't take it. It's again, you can't take it because your body is debased to the point where you cannot take that incredible light intensity that God is. So Moses got elected. And so when he gets up there, he's getting transformed by God every single time he goes up there.
Yep.
And he's shining light.
It gets shinier and shinier.
He got shinier and shinier. But understanding that, you could be transformed into that as well. But you would have to go through that surrender that Moses went through.
True. But you see, this is, just to return to our theme, this stage of God, this is a very personal relationship with God is possible, but it's scary. And it's distant, and people don't know what to do.
Well, they make it distant because they're frightened.
Absolutely, it's fear, and this is an interesting sort of insight: is that fear, in this case, an egoic fear, distances you from your true self, your true being, and this is again sort of the ego. This is reflected very nicely in this sort of egoic distancing, and then we go to the next stage, and this is the first. This fourth stage is the first return back to a personal relationship with God. And we see that in Christ because we see that he comes down and he says, there's no longer this duality. All of the other ones are duality, or very, very distant. The beginning stage is you're worshiping creation. You're a piece of this thing. You're just a pebble of sand, a pebble on the beach. And all the way up now to this is, you are of God, and you're returning. This is they call it salvation history, because in essence, the fall is being redeemed. Now, again, very poetic language, but what it's doing is saying that the recognition at the heart level, and Father Rohr talks to this very beautifully, of where the Christian mystics talked about the heart in the way that Tolle talks about the heart. Not that it's this lump of flesh beating away in your chest. Yes, it is, but it's really the place where you integrate the infinite and the corporeal. So the heart, the core of your being, the heart of your being, is where you can, they say that, the heart of Jesus, the heart is where you can reach into the infinite, where you can incorporate, where you bring that which is the moment of now, the vertical dimension, into the horizontal dimension of creation, and that intersection point, the heart, is where you have this personal relationship with the infinite. But it takes an effort. You have to reveal your weakness and reveal your, you have to get past your fear, reveal your weakness, and realize that you really do get past all the ego. You really do have a... Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's an acknowledgement of the weakness that is within you. And it's going back to what was mentioned before. You realize that you are incapable of being in his presence because the body itself is fallen. But if you wish to be in his presence and choose to be in that high frequency energy, you can come up to it if you allow yourself to be changed.
Exactly.
You just make the decision that you've got to change. And then in that relationship with the divine, with the awareness that is eternal, with the Father, with Jesus, you can allow the change to happen, but you have to choose it. The spirit that is, the infinite spirit, can come into you and cleanse you. But you have to make that decision first and foremost, and it usually means that you have to ask for forgiveness because you've been rolling in the mud all this time.
And it's all, if you look at it from the ego terms, it's all that you have to give up all that ego. And it's extremely difficult. And you have to come into the moment of now. And people find it very, very difficult because that's a higher frequency. You're not living in the past. You're not living in the future. You're not living in Christ said, living in your sins. No, you're living in the moment of now, in the true light of the infinite. And yes, it's like a burning point.
Oh, yes.
And yes, you will be shining. You see, all these analogies of Moses' face shining so brightly that people couldn't look upon it because he was in the moment of now. You have to, giving up all that ego dross is in essence the fall. The fall is falling into duality, is falling into separation. The realization of the personal relationship means that, yes, we're back to the garden, or we're even further along, but we say, not only do we have a God within us, and this goes back to Father Rohr's comment, God for us, God alongside us, God within us, but we are. Christ said, I am the Father, and the Father is me, and
unity.
You are too.
Yeah, no, it's coming back to a unity consciousness.
Unitary consciousness, yeah.
And it's also understanding that it's a process. Moses is, if you read it and how he went about it until his face was glowing, that's a process. Doesn't mean that you don't have problems along the way.
He was scared all the way through.
And he had to deal with a very stiff-necked people, as he called it. People will make you nuts. Doesn't matter if you're a prophet or a saint. They will still make you crazy.
Right.
And acknowledging that, it's like, all right, I need help. I need strength. Do I enter in to that source point connection? Am I willing? Can I get over myself enough to let go of whatever the offense was, the slights, the upset, the situation? It's again like Moses. He was so angry. He struck the rock a couple of times. Right. And he wasn't supposed to.
But that's a beautiful example. Again, you as on this road, when you suddenly realize that, yes, or not suddenly, but you come to the realization that you have a personal relationship, that you are God. It isn't all sunshine, puppies, and roses after that. It's very difficult.
You are in a relationship with God. And God is in you, you are in Him. And it's in that relationship that the ability to shift and change and let go. Because you need strength to let go of your ego. All right? You can't just do it on your own, but you can make the decision that you want to let go of your ego.
Yes.
Okay? But doing it, you need help. You need interventions because your ego's pretty darn strong if you're dealing with your ego on that level. Right. But if you're able to come into your awareness, your consciousness, therein lies the ability to receive the strength to change. You change your ego habits. Very difficult.
Very difficult, but with Tolle, and we talk about this a lot, and it goes again through the Christian mysticism. You find strength in the more you do it. The more Moses went up the mountain, the shinier he got, and the more his relationship with God grew stronger. But yet, even still, you can see at any moment you have the challenges. No matter what, the moment of now is still the moment of now. Your habit form to deny ego and to live in the moment of now, to say, is that so? To not make the story, to not distance yourself, not wallow in fear or wallow in thought or wallow in emotion of any kind.
And those 3 points I would like to clarify, frankly, because when you allow your thought concepts to take hold, in other words, your God is this kind of God. And there's a whole list of things that you put down as this is my God. We follow
rules.
You can follow a certain religion. Certain religions have very strict rules on the way you're supposed to do everything for God or how he thinks. And let's face it, there's so many people that look at this and go, wait, this is what is that called, where you have a little bit of power and then you lord it over people. There's a phrase for that.
Well, it's sort of the petty officialdom type of thing.
That's it. That petty officialdom mentality where you say, okay, I know what the rules are, so I'm going to lord this over you because you are not following the rules.
Right. And you get to say who is in and who is out. That's the petty officialdom.
And that is what a lot of people see in religion. They're saying, okay, you guys are just doing this petty officialdom thing.
Right.
It has no real connection to God, who is love and unconditional love.
Right. You move back down. The more you go into religio, which is the yoke, right? You move away from that interpersonal relationship with God. Jesus' relationship with his followers is a unitary consciousness. He's trying to bring them up into the unitary consciousness. Realize who you really are. Realize that you need to be me. You need to be God. You need to understand that you are a God.
You are part of
the more he said it, the crazier people got.
Yeah. And actually, they were angry at him because they felt that he was blaspheming.
Right.
You can't do that.
You're breaking the rules.
You can't do that. That's what they're saying. So since they felt he was a bad influence on all the other Jews, they all ganged up.
And killed him.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, though, see, we get to the last stage of God, if you will, because we're coming to the end. Oh, sorry.
Okay, I wanted to go back to the fact
sure.
that first and foremost, there are concepts that man puts forward, since there are those that believe that since they are super smart, they can outthink most humans, other human beings, then they have a concept that they feel that, well, this is who I think God is. And that's the phrase. This is who I think God is. And it's not a personal God. It's this concept of flows, of energy, and the universe in that description. And that makes it very convenient because God has now become unrelatable. It's just a series of almost equations that you're writing down. Nothing personal in them. Just, this is the description. They fall in love with the description of what they think the universe is, or what divine is, instead of having a real relationship. It just reminds me of like women in dating. You know, like, what is love? How do you know when you're in love? And like, you're reading about love and you want to checkbox everything to see whether or not you're in love. But that's not the relationship of love. No. The experience of love, the interaction, the energy, the being state.
The nowness of love.
But there are those that make that their God, where it's comfortable because I can manage this. This is my world. I manage it. In other words, they dictate who God is supposed to be.
Right.
Whether it is a being, a personal, like you're trying to say, okay, it's got to be, a description of God has got to be this way. You know, a man sitting on a throne with a long beard. But you can also do that. Again, they say they don't want to make it personal. You guys are too religious, meaning petty officialdom kind of stuff. You have to take all that out and appreciate that God is just these concepts. And it's like, no, your soul is not a concept. Your soul is. And it is eternal. And until you make that connection, you are always going to be pushing away a real relationship with God, just like the Israelites. Yeah, it's too much. I can't think.
Well, exactly. You're going back down. When you move in that direction, you're moving away because it's scary, and you're more comfortable with these boxes, these equations, whatever it is, this spiritual. So when you move closer and closer you get, the scarier it gets because more gets stripped away. And more becomes just you, the being. And you're getting very close to the infinite.
And it's truth that is not comprehensible to the human mind.
Exactly so is what I was about to say.
And so it is
getting outside of what you can think about.
And the other one, too, by the way, is feelings.
Yeah.
You know, people put their feelings on a pedestal. This is who I think God is. God is love, and their idea of love is all this emotion, and you do this, you do that. There are certain rules for that type of love, by the way.
Yes.
You know, if you don't do this, that means you don't love me.
Right.
So therefore, and that becomes a whole nother religion in of itself. And
right. I mean, the concepts of those things are just pushing it away. It becomes a different religion.
It's a different religion, and this is what they mean. What is meant by placing religion, placing idols, in your life,
if you will. But before we're just running a little bit. This is a big subject. The last stage of God. I know we don't have a lot of time. The last stage of God is where we're getting to, I think, right now. And yes, you can say at some point in all of human societies they've said this, but where we are right now, there's sort of an ascendancy that's coming into the world. There's sort of a transformative energy. You see it in people like Tolle. You see it in people like Father Rohr. This idea of a unitary consciousness is becoming a growing, unifying thing, and it's getting past religions. It's starting to push aside these veils. All these things are veils.
Right. And
when you start to see people like Tolle coming from his point of view, and Buddha coming from his point of view, and those people, or I forget his name, the other guy who talks about it quite a bit, and Father Rohr. All these various modalities are starting to meet at the middle. Everyone's starting to work their way towards the center of the elephant, okay?
Yeah.
If you know that story.
Yeah.
And when we get to the center of the elephant, there we all are, because it's all source.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires you to really get shiny, okay? To use our analogy, you've got to let the thing that is comfortable, the comfortable part of all these things, the comfortable part of this religion or that thought concept of this is love and I'm this and I'm that, all the identifying marks of I ams have to get stripped away. And as they get stripped away, it gets scary, but it also gets amazingly singular and amazingly unifying. And the closer we get to that, the closer we are to the real realization of what and who we are as beings in this incarnation.
Yes, and the truth of who God actually is. If you can let go, because one way I can only say that you can do this is that you have to let go of judgment. When you catch yourself judging somebody, you actually have to put a muzzle over your mouth or a muzzle over your head because you're thinking judgment. And that is super difficult to do. Even judgment on yourself, oh my gosh. But to hold that in abeyance because you don't know everything.
Right, and you shouldn't try to either.
Right.
But one thing we do know is that we've reached the end of this hour.
Yes, we have. So I'm Margaret.
And I'm Michael.
And thank you for listening.